I'm Diane Marchetti. We're here in the San Luis Obispo Railroad Museum today. It's August 11th, 2017, and we're going to be interviewing Clyde Elliot today. Clyde was hired by the Southern Pacific in 1956 as a brakeman, but he eventually worked his way up to be a conductor. So Clyde, what do you remember about the day you got hired?
Oh, I went to San Francisco. I lived in Redwood City on the peninsula, and my brother, he had worked for the railroad for 10 years at that particular time. He hired out in '46 as a brakeman, and he told me to go up to San Francisco and see Tugwell McDaniels at Third and Townsend. That's a depot in San Francisco, and then the company had a lot of offices upstairs. So I went upstairs to see the train master, and walked in, and this fella George was Tugwell's secretary. So I said, I'd like to hire out as a fireman. He said, we're not hiring firemen. I said, well, my brother told me that you were hiring, and he's, who's your brother? I said, Ralph Elliot. So Tugwell came out, he heard me say that, and he says, are you R.C.'s brother? I said, yes, I am. He said, George, hire him. So they hired me. That was mid-April. So I went right away. I worked the Redwood Local with C.D. Moore, was a conductor. Larry Hutman was a tag man. That's a boss brakeman, the best one on the whole system. Bert Richardson was a head man, and Buster Tummins was a rear man. And I worked that local. It switched industries around the peninsula, and I worked it for about a week. And every idle moment, they had me doing hand signs and asking me all kinds of questions and reading the rule book, and they were real hard on me because my brother preceded me, and they wanted to make sure I knew what I was doing and I didn't get hurt and I did a good job. So I worked that job for a week, and that was a day job. I went to work at Bay Shore Yards at 4:40 a.m. and then it came down to Redwood City. And then I worked Pappy Herman's job, and I can't remember the brakeman on that job, but that was a night job, the night millbrae job, and all really neat guys. But back to the Redwood job, about 3 days after I started, I noticed Bert Richardson never showed up. And of course, when you first hire out as a brakeman, you follow the engine. You stay with the engine. So it makes it easier for you, and you know exactly what to do. And you take orders from the tag man, Larry Hutman. And he was a very caring, compassionate man and extremely good railroad man. So after about, well, I worked the third or fourth day, and finally I said, Larry, I said, where's Bert? Well, Bert stayed home, and they let me do his job. And I'm getting 50 cents an hour. We worked 15 hours and 59 minutes every day, and I got $8. And of course, they were getting regular pay. But he stayed home, he's on a time slip, and I'm doing his job, which was okay. Of course, it was hush-hush, you know. They didn't want the company to know it. But I worked for almost 2 weeks, and then I had to work, do a long line, a run from San Francisco to Santa Barbara and back. And after that, I accomplished that. Then I marked up on the extra board. And the first trip was a trip that I almost quit.
Why?
Well, we got the rock job out of Bay Shore, went on duty about 7 o'clock in the morning, and steam engine, I started at steam, and I'm working a head end, and we're going along, and there was a road that was parallel to the railroad tracks, and there was a guy driving happened to be a Filipino man, driving a 1949 panel delivery truck. And he waved to us, and I don't know whether he was preoccupied or what, but he turned right in front of us at the road crossing, and we killed him instantly.
Oh, dear.
That was at 9:17 in the morning, May 3rd, 1956. And it was, you know, here I am 20 years old, and to see something like that, my first payday on the job. But those things happen, you know, so. So anyhow, I worked in the San Francisco area, San Francisco, Tracy, Oakland, San Jose, Watsonville, till about 1960, I think 64. And then I moved here, I moved to Santa Margarita. But I worked the brakeman's extra board. And I wanted to work freight primarily. I liked freight, and I was real bashful and withdrawn, so I didn't like work passenger trains. And you could do one of two things. You could get a uniform and accept the call, or you could mark the uniform off. You didn't have a uniform. Well, then you'd go in what they call the penalty box. So they'd take your name off the extra board for a week. You wouldn't work. And then they'd mark up after a week, and you'd go to the bottom of the extra board. Well, you might lay there for a couple of days and catch another 7-day passenger job. So if you wanted to work and make any money, you got a uniform.
Yeah.
But the bad thing about it, they never had a provision for laying the uniform off to have it cleaned. So you get penalized for that too. So I worked primarily freight, and one job in particular that comes to mind was I worked a Redwood City job. Now, we used to go to work out of Bay Shore when I first started my career, and then later they called the jobs, instead of a local, they call them a road switcher, and they kept the locomotive and the caboose. Like the Redwood City job, they kept it there. So you didn't have to go clear to San Francisco or South San Francisco. And then the Millbrae job, they'd keep that in they kept it in Redwood City also. So they had the morning job and the night job. So I got called for the afternoon or night job, Millbrae job. And Phil Pickett was the conductor. And Phil liked his barley corn. He mostly beer, really. He didn't drink too much hard liquor. But anyhow, he was a young guy, and he and I were good buddies. And I worked with a kid by the name of Mike Gathers. He was a brakeman. But they always made me the rear brakeman because I was a cook. So whenever I'd catch a job that I was going to be there any length of time, they'd make me the rear man, and because I'd do the cooking. So I guess I cooked pretty fair. I don't know, but
they must have liked it.
Yeah, they must have liked it. So anyhow, got a job. We caught that job, the night Millbrae job, with Phil and Mike Gathers, and I can't remember the other two guys. It might have been Mad Dog Robinson. I'm not sure.
That was his nickname, Mad Dog?
I named him. It was MD, and I named him Mad Dog. Yeah,
okay.
Mike. Crazy, I'll tell you. He was something else. But anyhow, we'd get our train at Redwood Yard, and then we would start west, which going towards San Francisco is west, and going away from is east. So we'd go west, and we would switch on the way up to Millbrae. Well, they'd drop me off at Broadway Burlingame, and they'd each give me $2. So there was a conductor and the rear brakeman, is myself, the tag man and the head man, and then the engineer and the fireman. So I'd drop off while they were switching, and I'd go do the grocery shopping. And if you can imagine, for $2 each. And so then we'd go on, switch, and we'd get up to Millbrae, and they would shove the caboose into J-Wax, Johnson Wax Spur. And I had a cord, electrical cord, I'd plug in a duplex on the dock, and I had TV in there and the whole thing, lights.
Pretty nice.
Oh yeah, I had it all fixed up. So I would get stuff set up, And then I'd go with them down what they called the boondocks. We switch, I don't know if you remember, Purity Stores. There was a chain of Purity Stores. Well, they had their West Coast warehouse there on the boondocks. So they had 2 tracks, and I'd go down and help them switch that. And then come back up, and then they would go over to the other side of the industry area there, and I would do the dinner. I'd cook while they were switching. Well, it's one particular night, I had a hibachi sitting on the back platform, and I was going to barbecue some steaks, London broil. And I told Phil, old Pickett, I said, hey, I'm going to have to go over PG&E or GE in the other part of the industry area and help them because they need, they got a lot of work, heavy load. So you watch a hibachi. Yeah, he said, okay, Clyde. So we go over there. We're over there about an hour and a half, and we're come back and sitting up there in the engine. And I said, I wonder what that smoke is. Oh. And we come around the corner, and the whole back end of the caboose is on fire.
Oh, no.
Well, we got the hoses out. They had a tank, a water tank in the caboose, and you could pump it. So we put the fire out, and the platforms all burn off, and all the steps are burned off. Oh, no. So I thought, it's just skeleton steel, and I thought, holy Toledo. Phil had gone up to the Blue Peacock up in Millbrae, above the bowling alley, and he's sitting there sopping up beer, getting drunk, and forgot all about the hibachi.
Oh, no.
So I went ahead and, and salvaged stuff, fixed dinner, got dinner fixed, and we used to take about a 2.5, 3 hour dinner break. Then we'd sit there and just enjoy ourselves, watch TV and have a good time, then go back to work. So I told Phil, I said, we can't leave the caboose like this. So there was a place in San Carlos, a lumber yard, Klamath Lumber it was called, and we knew the guys real well because we'd spot cars there all the time. So I got a hold of him and I says, hey, we got a problem. He said, what's the matter? I says, well, the platform of the caboose and the stairs on both sides burned off. He said, well, give me the measurements. And he says, I'll have the lumber all cut for you tomorrow when you come in. I said, okay. Wow. So we had the only caboose on the system with tongue and groove redwood platform and stairs. But Phil, he was a character. He's probably gone now. He drank so darn much. But he and another story, he and I, after I'd moved down this area, he was a conductor again, and a young guy and easy to work for. And we had supposed to have an eastbound train coming in. We were going to Santa Barbara, and it was delayed. So he said, let's go downtown and get ice cream. So I was okay. So downtown San Luis. So we go down and we go in this ice cream parlor, and there's a little old white-haired lady, and she had a coin purse, had full of coins, and she dropped them, and Phil says, heads. Everybody looks, but he was a character, and like I say, he was a great guy to work for. You did your job, he didn't bother you, and most all the guys were that way. You knew what to do, and you just did what you were supposed to. There were a few guys, they were a lost ball in high weeds. They didn't know what to do. They hired out. They never should have hired them. They were dangerous to the crew and dangerous to themselves. And,
did they last very long on the job?
Yeah, unfortunately. In regard to that, when back to the peninsula, San Francisco Peninsula, I was working a Redwood City job, and Harley Gray was a tag man, and John Torbett was a conductor, and I think Crunch Crawford was the other brakeman, and I was working the rear end again, and we had a student brakeman, And Harley, he'd give a 2 sign like that. That meant let 2 cars go. We were kicking cars, making trains up. And he give this kid a 2 sign, and he give me a sign to ride down in a 5 rail and stop him to clear two cars. Talking with my hands.
That's okay.
And that's what we talked. So anyhow, we had what they call hydro cushion cars, and they had just moved the brakes, the hand brakes, from the top part of the car down to the bottom because of the safety factor, and they had a catwalk about 12 inches wide on each end of the car. And then they have a handbrake. Well, they only had it on one end of the car. So I was on the car would be on my right, and it never had a handbrake. And the handbrake was over on the car on my left. So he started kicking them, and the student, I just started reaching over to grab the grab iron, and the student pulled a pin between these 2 cars. Well, fortunately, I got the grab iron, and my feet went out from under me, and I went down, and I got a blood blister right here on my leg. I come that close to getting cut in half long ways. So I pulled myself up, and of course Harley, he washed him out. He gave him a big hole, stop sign, a big stop sign. And Fred Curran was the engineer, and he caught the sign. But you still move 30 or 40 feet.
Yeah.
I mean, he big holed him. And the kid come over, and he says to me, he started talking to me. I said, don't say anything. Just don't say anything to me. And Harley told me he should take a break. I said, if I do, I'll quit, because it scared me half to death. And so finally I said to the kid, I said, come here. And I said, what'd you pull a pin for? He said, well, I thought he'd give me a 1-car sign. I says, okay, let me tell you something right now. And any other rail will tell you this. Thinking is not enough. You have to know. You don't think about it. You have to know. And if you don't know, don't do anything. That's the safest course. So he never came back. He was a nice young fella, but it scared him so bad, he never did come back. And it just, I was very fortunate. Good Lord was looking after me, I'll tell you. But I had enough strength to pull myself up, fortunately.
Yeah.
And I know I went home and about 4 o'clock that afternoon, and my wife at the time, my ex-wife, she said, what's the matter with you? I was still shaking, I guess. And I showed her. The holy mackerel. But things like that happen,
It was a tough job.
And
it was a lot of tough guys, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. With big hearts, though, they were compassionate, and they do anything in the world for you. You never went hungry, because if you were broke, they'd always buy you a meal. And of course, we usually run a tab at all the greasy spoons. And in regard to that, I was working I'm kind of bouncing around, but I was working a Sunnyvale job. I think of things that are so darn funny. And we working a Sunnyvale job, and it was time to go to Beans, go eat. And Carson, what did they call him? The dog man. He was a dog trainer and a dog shower.
Oh.
And then there was Grits. He was from Tennessee. Charlie White, I call him Grits. And then Steve, I can't remember his nickname. But anyhow, we walked in this little beanery downtown Sunnyvale, and it was just, it had a bar or a counter and stools, and it was only about 8 feet wide. Well, there was a guy sitting at the end of the counter. He was not a rail, and he's reading a newspaper. And there was the cook. He was a cook and a waiter. So we just walked in and we sat down, and this guy, he ordered a ham sandwich. So the cook reaches into the refrigerator to get this ham. It's on a platter, and it's got the gel on it, and it's slippery.
Oh, no.
He drops it on the floor, and he looks around, and the guy's still buried in the newspaper. And he goes to pick it up, and he kicked it with his foot,
no.
and it went to full length and bounced against the wall. And he's looking, of course, I'm watching him, and this guy's reading the paper, and he picked that up. He sliced him off, made him a sandwich, and gave him. He never did know the difference. But it was just.
I'm thinking you probably did not order a ham
no,
sandwich.
No way. But it was so darn funny. Just characters. I mean,
Oh, jeez.
and we associated.
All right, so you've mentioned a bunch of nicknames that people had. So what
Yeah.
was your nickname?
Well, my nickname was Rattlesnake, and I don't know whether you can see this buckle, but that's,
Yeah, I see the rattlesnake on your
that's a
buckle
rattlesnake.
there.
And the reason being is I killed 4 rattlesnakes in 3 days
Oh my gosh.
on the railroad, and I killed one. He was it was 9:30 at night, and we were in a hole at Bradley, in the siding at Bradley. We were coming east, and conductor was Bobby Rice. I was working the chain gang on the west end between San Luis Obispo and Watsonville, and I'd gained seniority so I could hold a decent job, a regular job. Of course, the chain gang, it's a regular job, and the only thing regular about it is you work with the same guys all the time, but you're still on 24-hour-a-day call. Mm-hmm. So, old Bobby Rice, and we hid in the hole there, so I'm the rear man, so I hit the dirt, start going up to the head end, checking the train on the way, and I got my lantern, walking along, and boy, the light on my lantern picked up this rattlesnake. He was as big around as my wrist, and he's about 6.5 feet long. And I thought, I don't want any part of that dude. And he's crawling right along the rail because it's nice and warm.
Oh,
see?
yeah.
And we find out later he was going over for water, going over to a horse trough to get water. Anyhow, I stopped dead, and I was about 10 feet from him. And I found a board, and I was going to poke him with a board, and I threw a dirt clod at him. And before it got to him, he struck.
Oh my goodness.
He was nasty. So anyhow, I got this board, and I managed to mess him up pretty bad. And Bobby, in the meantime, I got Bobby on the radio, and I told him, I says, hey, I got a friend up here for you, and you ought to come on up here. So he come up, and he was standing behind me when I reached down to cut the rattlers off, and of course, the nerves, I guess he moved, and old Bobby must have jumped 10 feet, and he said to me, "What's the matter? You afraid?" I said, "Well, if you hadn't moved, I'd have been right on top of you." I said, "You jumped 10 feet. What are you talking about being afraid?" So anyhow, I had those rattles from that particular rattlesnake. I got them someplace. I don't know where they are, but I had killed 2 or 3 other ones, well, 2 other ones, and then the 4th one in 3 days, and they gave me this guy, Babyface Nelson. That's another one I nicknamed. He was a hog kid. Brothers, there was Deuce, so he was number 2, Nelson number 2, and then Babyface. And Babyface gave me a rattlesnake buckle that was, I think it was made out of pewter or something. And I took this one here, or I took it to K-John's Jewelry's to Stan Sherwin. Stan Sherwin used to be a brakeman, and he worked for me at one time, so he's a good buddy of mine. So I told him, I said, I want a buckle made out of silver. So he made it out of silver, and then the tongue is gold, and the rattle's gold, and the eyes are rubies. So it's kind of special to me. Yeah. So I just got the nickname Rattlesnake. I guess they just called me CW before that. And then in regard to that, working with Bobby again, we come out of Watsonville one night, coming east, and Bobby's smoking a cigar. Well, you knew when he was smoking a cigar, he'd been drinking, because he's trying to hide the alcohol. Oh. So anyhow, we're coming along. We got to take the hole at Welsona, and for 371, 371. There's a little. That's a little zipper. The big zipper was 373. The little zipper was 371, and they were piggyback trains, hot shot piggyback trains. So they're sitting there at the siding waiting for us. And old Ironhead Aronson, he was head man on that train, but he was kind of cantankerous. And normally, in a normal situation, the head man would call the rear man on the opposing train and say, highball a switch. But old Ironhead, he wouldn't do that for you. So I had to get off and line the switch. So we had a bay window caboose. Boy, it just seems like it was yesterday. Bay window caboose, and Bobby's sitting there looking out the window. Well, I got off the front of the caboose, and 371 is sitting there just in the clear, the locomotive. And we start in the siding, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I lined the switch. Well, I lined the switch right under the caboose. So that meant that part of the caboose would go on the siding, the other part would go down the main line and hit the locomotive of 371. And I lined it right back real quick. And it just clicked. The trucks went over it. I lined up behind and got on. And Bobby met me at the back door. And he's all puffed up like a toad, beet red. And man, he is just furious with me. And I says, don't say anything. I said, you know, they call me Rattlesnake. And he said, what? I said, they call me Rattlesnake, and you were watching me, and I was just trying to prove to you how quick I am. So when we got in here to the depot at San Luis, there was about 20 guys in there, and it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. He said, you know what this damn fool did? And everybody knew already. They had heard, I guess. Everybody's laughing. And they said, well, Bobby, he's quick, isn't he? You know. But he was quite a guy. And I worked with him on a regular basis for quite a while. And he lived in Watsonville. And I had a shack up there, a little railroad shanty that I lived in, a little apartment. I started renting it. It cost me $18 a month. And I think it was $50 a month when I quit 18 or 20 years later, when I gave it up, or $100 a month. But anyhow, it started out at 18, and it went to 23, and it just went up, you know. But it was kind of neat. It was a studio type, and I'd always have food there, and you know, if we had a big dinner, and I'd take leftovers with me, and I had a stereo and a TV, and it was real comfortable. But anyhow, I had to buy groceries sometimes. So we're going west, and I got Bobby riled, as usual. He's just so mad he can hardly say anything. So finally, he turned the overhead light on, and he said, shut up. Yeah, I said, okay, Bobby. And we'd go along for about 5 minutes. I said, you still want me to be quiet? No, just agitating him.
You were just trying to aggravate him.
Oh, yeah. And he'd get so darn mad at me. And so we're coming in the yard in Watsonville, and I say, Bobby, I told you to shut up. I said, I got something important to talk to you about. I said, I got to go grocery shopping. Can I take you home and then use your car and come and get you when you get called? It just kind of rubbing it in. But he'd always let me, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of these guys, some of them that were cantankerous, and other ones, you know, they were all good-hearted. But anyhow, I knew them from the time I was about 11 years old, because my brother would call. Oftentimes I'd come from Redwood City to San Jose, and I'd stay with him, like for a weekend or whatever, and he'd call, and he was coming in from Watsonville and going to go to San Francisco. They would go through. He would come and get me, and I'd ride on the train with him. So I knew a lot of guys, you know. So that was kind of neat. So I knew them way before I hired out. But
How nice. When did you switch from San Francisco down to San Luis Obispo?
I think it was '64. My ex, her stepdad passed away, and her mother lived in Madera, California, and she was grieving, and so she figured she'd go over and stay with her mom and help her through the grief for a while. So I took a apartment in Margarita, Santa Margarita, and San Luis was a neat place to work out of, because it was the only bad job in the whole area was Lompoc. And that the only reason that was bad is because of the drive, you know, from I'm living in a Atascadero or Margarita and have to drive clear to Lompoc. And there was really no place to stay down there. We stayed in an old coach. You lived like an animal, and ate in restaurants. And I didn't like Lompoc at all. And the wind, oh man. And that diatomaceous earth, I mean, it's blowing all the time down there, and you're breathing that stuff. But most of your work out of San Luis was chain gang. It was, you know, we went through from San Luis to Santa Barbara and stayed at the Californian Hotel. And then we went to Watsonville. So it was 152 miles to Watsonville. That's a day and a half's pay. And then 119 to Santa Barbara. And then we started going through to L.A. Excuse me, that was 218 or 226. And I kind of liked that. That was pretty neat. And
where did you stay when you went down there?
Well, we stayed at Figueroa Hotel on Figueroa and Olympic, right downtown in the worst part of L.A. there is. There was a lot of prostitution and drugs and hold up, you know, they'd rob you. And in fact, one night, Dave Reynolds and he was a hoghead, young fella, good hoghead. And we were down at the Figueroa, and he says, "Hey, Snake, you want to go up and get something to eat?" I said, "Yeah," and I love pasta, Italian food. So we walked up the Italian restaurant about a block and a half away, and went in there and had a nice dinner. And it was, I believe, in the fall, because we both had jackets on. And we come out of the restaurant about 7:30 at night, and this black dude come up there and he says, "Hey, I need some money." And Dave says, "I'll get out of here. I'm going to need money." And he pulled a switchblade out. He says, "Well, I guess I'll have to take it." And Dave says, No, wait a minute now. If you want money that bad, I got something for you." And he pulled a .357 Magnum. He said, "How much do you want?"
Oh my gosh.
And that guy took off I mean, just, he was running, I'll tell you. And then this guy by the name of Roy Abels, he was conductor. He had a wife that was really, really ill. And he had somebody staying with her. And anyhow, Roy was always carried a lot of cash, and he had a lot of jewelry, and he was always flashing $20 bills or $100 bills. So one night, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, there's a knock on the door. LAPD, they said. Well, he thought his wife had passed, and LAPD would, you know, notifying him. Well, come to find out, it was these two dudes that they robbed him. So they come in, got in the room, and they grabbed him, and they put a pillowcase over his head, tied him up, threw him on the bed, and they took everything he had, all his jewelry, all his money, and everything. Well, they had other instances similar to that. Guy come in, and there was termite. He looked like a 12-year-old kid. He was a hog kid. He was a really good hog kid. He was my hog kid for quite a while. And this dude got him in the bathtub, standing in the bathtub, and pulled a shower curtain. And there were four of them. There was Deuce, and Termite, and the one name escapes me, and I can see him. He was a brakeman. There were two brakemen and two hogheads, and they were playing poker. And they had the door open. It was a nice warm day. And he put him behind the shower curtain, and he turned the faucet on the sink, and they thought they were going to shoot him. Well, Termite kept agitating this guy. You know, I'm not afraid of you, and calling him all kinds of names and everything. And the other three guys, they're trying to shut him up. Well, finally they got him to keep from looking out the curtain, and the water's running, and of course he took off. So they got brave enough to come out from behind, and he's gone. And I remember Deuce, he cried for, I don't know, months, because they took his wedding ring.
Oh.
They took his They took their watches, the whole thing, you know, and wallets and everything. And finally, we had enough of it. We said, hey, we're not doing this anymore. So the union got a hold of the company, and they moved us out to the Holiday Inn in Glendale. And you know, you could walk in the evening, you could go to a restaurant, and pretty much do whatever you wanted. It was a lot better deal.
So the union really went to bat for you.
Oh
in that
yeah,
instance,
yeah. It was just unsafe down there, you know. Maybe right down there in the worst part of town. So Glendale was a lot better, and that was a good run. The last 3 years of my career, I think, I had a regular job. I'd hurt my back on a switch that I turned in up a 10 gear, a bad switch. I was legislative representative, which is a fancy name for a safety man. So anything unsafe on the railroad in my district, I'd write a letter to the train master in that area, and then also write a letter to the superintendent of that area. And if it didn't get taken care of in 30 days, then I'd get a hold of the Public Utilities Commissioner or State Commerce Commission, and they'd handle it. So this one particular switch, I had turned in 3 years before, and nobody ever did anything with it. And it was a siding that wasn't used that much, and we were going east, and Leroy Varney was a conductor, prince of a man, God rest his soul. He was sure a nice guy. He was my conductor. Crunch Crawford was the head man. And we were heading in for Amtrak. And I went to line up behind, and I pulled the switch handle up and just went halfway, and it stopped. And it took me right to my knees. Oh. Well, it herniated the fourth lumbar. And Leroy managed to line the switch and got me in the caboose, and I laid down on the bench there all the way to L.A. And then they took me off the caboose, and they put me on a Greyhound bus.
Oh my!
It never missed a stop. It stopped in every burg. I thought they were going to have to take the jaws of life to get me out of it when I got here. And they took me right to the hospital, and I was in the hospital 9 days in traction.
Oh my gosh!
And got better, and then sometime later, I was getting into a carryall to go down in the yard, and somebody left a newspaper on the floor, and I slipped, and I herniated the fifth disc. We one day I got called, and they said, "Hey, Elliot, you're gonna be on C yard, 1 track." I said, "Okay." So they take the head man and go in the carryall. He'd go down the roundhouse with the hog head, and they'd get the power, and they'd come up, cap the train. The rear man, he would go on the engine, and he would drop off at the top end of the yard. And when we pulled out of the yard, he would check the train as it was moving out of the yard, and then catch the caboose. So, and then they would take the conductor in the carryall. They'd take him down to the caboose. So I get down there. I got the way bills and the switch lists and everything, and I walk over to track 1. I look up at the caboose, and the numbers don't jibe. I thought something's wrong here, so I checked 2 or 3 cars ahead of the caboose, and they don't jibe either. So they got a pipe that sticks up out of the ground, and it's got a bullhorn on each end. You press a button, you talk to the yardmaster. And I went to hit the button, and he says, "Yeah, Elliot, I know." He said, nothing matches. I said, no, what's going on? He says, well, they ordered a caboose, and they put 13 cars on the rear end. They'll airmail you the bills at the top end of A yard. I said, okay. So you pick them up with a hoop like you do orders. So we get everything together and we leave town. And we're coming through Moore Park. Larry Manthy's the hoghead. Coming down around the curve, you're coming downhill across Highway 118 or Los Angeles Boulevard. And there's a big sweeping curve to the left. And you can see the whole train. And there's a mobile home park, huge mobile home park on this curve. It's like almost like a half moon. And all of a sudden, and I got a green brakeman, he's sitting on the other side. And all of a sudden, Larry says, hold on, Snake, we're going in the ditch. And we're doing 50 miles an hour. Well, we had a bench seat, and I put my hands through arms through the arm of the chair to brace myself, and my feet up on the bulkhead. And I can't get to the radio because it's on the other side, and I ain't going to get up. And I start seeing this stuff flying in the air.
Oh, my.
There's 250-pound sacks of beans, 100 feet up in the air. And the track is just like spaghetti. And I'm thinking, will we ever stop? And we're going down a hill. And we finally come to a halt. And they holler, Snake, Snake, are you okay? Are you okay? I said, hey, we're fine. Are you guys all right? Yeah. So I called Oxnard. I said, you better get the emergency equipment out here. We just went on the ground. And we got 37 cars on the ground and one locomotive.
Oh, my God.
Right on the crossing.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
And it's Highway 118.
Oh, no.
Well, what had happened, everything went to the land side. Nothing on the ocean side. And there were a couple of cars parked on the ocean side. Well, what happened is there was a farmer that had come out from a field ahead of these cars on a tractor. And he's putting along about 8 miles an hour. And I guess they got a double line or something, but they can't get by him. So I think it was a God thing, because the crossing was completely clear on the land side. And when you're in a wreck, it piles everything up within the length of a football field. Then it starts going out and up. That's just a phenomenon. But when we got stopped, there was a car and caboose and 13 cars left on the rail that they had put on. So I think that was a God thing too. So we had fixed wing airplanes and helicopters, and we had everything cordoned off. And I see, about a quarter mile away, I see this white van pull up, and I'm looking, what's going on? And this guy's standing on top of it with a tripod. Well, I'm up there where the wreck is, and pretty soon this car pulls up, and this guy gets out, and he got a suit, white shirt and tie on, and a white hat. I said, hey, what are you doing here? This is a restricted area. He said, who are you? I said, I'm C.W. Elliot, the conductor of this train. He said, well, son, you're doing a fine job. I'm so-and-so, assistant superintendent, L.A. division. I said, you got any ID? He said, yes, I do. And he showed me his ID, and he said, you are doing a good job. So he said, he wanted to know my full name and my address and all this stuff. And he said, well, what'd you think? Well, I used some nasty language. I said, it scared the S out of me. And he says, well, I can imagine, So 3 days later, we got a newspaper from Simi Valley. It's got this article on the front page, and it's quoting what I said. Well, come to find out, this guy that had a tripod, it was a directional microphone. And he was picking up our conversation. But then old Giles shows up, Bill Giles, who was a train master here. He says, how are you okay? I said, yeah, but I'm shook up. He says, What are you talking about? You've been in derailments before. I said, yeah, but nothing like this one. It's the worst one I've ever been in. And I said, you know, Marty's probably, if the news, if she's watching the news, she doesn't know whether we're okay or what. She knows, you know, I was in L.A. and probably got on my way home. So I think I called her on PBX and let her know. I said, hey, I'm all right. Nobody got hurt. There was one fella that was killed, and he was a young college poly student who was riding on some, he had a master key to these new cars that they ship, and he was sitting in one of the cars, and he lost his life. But nobody else got hurt. They evacuated the mobile home park, and they took him up to Moore Park College because there was some insecticide that had leaked. So anyhow, we had 3 locomotives. There wasn't a tattletale in any of them. So Bill says to me, how fast were you going? I said, we were doing between 48 and 50 miles an hour because Larry put the first service in him, 6 pounds to get him settled down. And I said, Larry, if it's 50 mile an hour speed limit, he's either going 50 or under. That's Larry. And I said, if he tells you something, you can take it to the bank. You know that. Well, they kept after me and kept after me. They wanted to make it human error. But Wounded Knee, he was an American native, big guy. He was on Amtrak before we went over there, and he called me later, and he says, hey, Snake, he says, I went over a solar kink in that area, and there was an assistant road foreman riding with us, and he said, I told him, you better report that right now, because the track temperature was 120 degrees, and we had ribbon rail, and it caused a kink. And it was at 3:10 in the afternoon when this happened, so the hottest part of the day. And then I had phone calls at home from the Public Utilities Commission and Interstate Commerce Commission. And finally I told them, I said, hey, look, as far as I'm concerned, you could be Mickey Mouse or whoever. I don't know who you are. I can't see your credentials over the phone. So if you want to talk to me anymore, you come and see me or tell me where you want me to be, because I'm not talking to you anymore. Well, it finally, it ended. It was over with. But they always wanted to nail a guy. You know, it's always your fault, because they didn't want to do equipment or anything like that.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, and a lot of accidents are caused by human error.
oh, yeah.
But not always.
No. Well, we had one, the old Snowden. He shoved line there in Guadalupe and shoved over a derail a bunch of tank cars, propane and oil, and I don't know how many he put in the ground. So I said to Bill Giles, we had a love-hate relationship. We loved to hate one another.
Oh.
Anyhow, he did, I think he respected me, but he didn't like me, because I was a thorn in his side, you know, being a safety guy. And I tried to tell him, I said, you know, what's the matter with you? I said, it's a union-elected job. If you don't have me, you're going to get somebody else, and you know how I operate. So get off my back. But anyhow, I said, what'd Snowden get for putting those tankers on the ground in Guadalupe? He said, he never got anything. I said, you'd have fired me. He said, well, you know better. I said, thanks a million, you know. That's what I get for being a decent brakeman and conductor. But anyhow, it was something else. It was a career that I loved early in my career when I was living at home with my mother and I was single. And you'd get laid off the day after Thanksgiving. Then they'd call you back about 2 days before Christmas. Then they'd lay you off January 2nd, and you'd be off work until the 1st of May or April. And as you gained seniority, it got a little better. So I told my mother, God rest her soul, many times, that if they'd just pay me the gas and give me a few bucks for a meal to go to work, I'd work for free. I loved it that much.
Yeah.
But, of course, that never happened. But, yeah, the characters we had.
Who do you think was the biggest character that you worked with? Hard to pick.
No, Mad Dog Robinson. Yeah, Mad Dog. He had to tell you a story. It's it's a little bit off color, but Sammy Jordan's the conductor, and Mad Dog's a head man, and I was a rear man. Can't remember the hog head, and we're coming out of Oakland, going to San Francisco around the bay over the Dumbarton Bridge. I just learned it's Dumbarton. I always thought it was D-U-N, not D-U-M, but it's Dumbarton. And we had a load of pigs. We had double-decker cars.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to entrain stock 10 cars behind the locomotive or 10 cars ahead of the caboose. That's the rules. So we got a set out up there in Redwood City Yard, and when he set 19 cars out, it's funny how I can remember this, set 19 cars out in the yard, stopped to clear Middlefield Road because it was a main thoroughfare there, and raining, it was pouring, and there was a puddle probably as big as this building off to the right, about 8 inches, 10 inches deep, and it was all, muddy.
Yeah.
And of course, we got rain gear on. So we stopped way out there in the boondocks. And Mad Dog's going to make the set out. Well, he's got to take an extra 10 cars over to the yard. He's got to shove them into a clear rail, make the set out, leave the pigs there, pick up the 10 cars, reach over and grab the pigs, and then come back and get on the train.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any of this makes sense to you, but
Yeah, it does.
so anyhow, and they can't get to me, the officials, back where we are, because we're out in the middle of the slough area, so they can't drive there. The only way they can get there is a helicopter. So I don't have to get out of the caboose and walk up.
Mm-hmm.
We got a nice fire going, So finally, Sammy says, "Snake," I said, "Yeah." He says, "You're going to have to go up and see what's going on." He just drive me nuts. We've been here way too long. Well, I should have stayed on the head end to begin with to help him. So I start up, and I almost get to the crossing, and here I see they're coming back, shoving back, and Mike bails off and lands in this big puddle. So I get up there and I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well," and I'm laughing, and he's sloshing. His boots are all full of water. He's just sopping wet. He says, I'm riding that car back, and he says, I look up, and I'm looking at this pig, the wrong end of him, and he starts wagging his tail.
Oh, no.
So he said, "I know what's coming next." So he says, I bailed. Well, when he did, of course, the hoghead big hold him. And I couldn't help but laugh. And he was into stuff like that all the time. It was just stuff he did. He was a recovering alcoholic, and he was like an old lady.
What do you mean?
Meticulously clean.
Oh.
I smoked at the time, and he'd call. He bought a brand new Cadillac, beautiful car,
Mm-hmm.
and if it was misty, he'd call. "Hey, Snake, can you pick me up?" He didn't want to take the car out of the weather. So he lived right over, not too far from here, about a half mile from here in apartments. So I'd pick him up. Well, then he says, when we get through the shift, he was lonely, terribly lonely.
Mm.
He'd say, if it were in the morning, like, "Hey, Snake," I said, "What? Why don't we stop by to buy you breakfast before you take me home?" See? And then, of course, we'd have breakfast and go home. And I'd smoke a cigarette and do the ash, and he'd pick the ashtray up, and he'd empty it and wipe it out and put it back down. And finally I'd tell him, "Leave it alone, you drive me nuts." But he was lonely, and he and I went way back. Oh, his mother owned a big avocado ranch in Santa Barbara. She was well-to-do.
Mm-hmm.
And drinking, and he got fired. Well, for Rule G, he ends up on the San Francisco Beltline It's a short line railroad up there. And that's the end of the line. I mean, that's the bottom.
Right.
So he says, here I am. My mother won't let me come home because I drank. And I'm up there working on the belt line. And he says, the conductor's he wears a derby with a pair of striped overalls. And he says, he's a whack, nutcase. And they're all probably there because of Rule G. You know, that's where they ended up. So,
And
Mike,
can you explain what Rule G is?
Rule G is the use of alcohol or drugs while on duty or subject to duty. So, he's the pin puller. He's the head man. Well, they're kicking cars up onto an apron, and eventually they shove them onto a ferry to go across the bay to take them to the NWP, Northwestern Pacific. So they got this car of lumber, and he said it's a beautiful evening. And there's the real fancy restaurant, and all these people are sitting out on this veranda or porch or whatever you want to call it, and they're eating dinner. It's a nice seafood restaurant down on the where the docks are in San Francisco. And he says this car of lumber, it goes up on the apron there, and it's heading down on this track area before they shove them get them all together and shove them onto the ferry. Well, the rear man's supposed to catch it and tie a handbrake on it. Well, he went off somewhere. He's either going to the restroom or just goofing off. And this carload of lumber, it's going along, and all of a sudden it just goes right off the end of the thing, right into the bay. And all these people are looking, splash,
no.
And down it goes.
Oh, no.
And it's all the lumber is bundled together with a piece of steel. So it's one piece, you know. So the whole thing goes to the bottom of the bay, and everybody's sitting there looking, and all of a sudden the lumber comes up. So Mad Dog, he's telling me this story. And I'm just in stitches. And he says, I'm done. He says, my first day on the job. And I'm on the only railroad in the United States I could work on. And I'm going to get fired from it. And I can't go home. He says, I guess I'm going to end up in Skid Row. So he says, the head man walks over and tells the conductor about it. And the conductor says, well, I got to call the train master. So he calls the train master, and about 15 minutes later he said, here comes this guy in a car, and he skids up and throws ballast all over the place, gets out, says to the conductor, okay, you guys, just for that, no more overtime tonight. He said he got in the car and left. But he says, I couldn't believe it. But Mike was in the one thing after another like that. He always getting into some kind of a jam. Good-hearted guy, do anything in the world for you, but he was a character. He and all the rest of them. And it just...
So when you came to the end of your career with the railroad, what happened, like say on your last day or your last week?
Well, that's a story in itself.
Yeah?
Okay. I'm working a conductor's extra board, all right? And they're working me every 9 hours. I got the true herniated discs in my lower back that have never been really taken care of. And sciatic nerve, my left leg is killing me. So the day before Easter, I called up to lay off. They said, you can't lay off. I said, lay me off old injury, because I could hardly walk. So all the red flags go up. So they laid me off. Well, I call a couple days later to mark up. They said, you have to have a doctor's excuse. So I had an orthopedic surgeon, and I don't recall his name right now. Harway, I think, Dr. Harway. And real good doctor here in San Luis. He's since retired, long time ago he retired. So anyhow, I went to see him, and he put me in some therapy, and he gave me, after a week, he gave me a release. So I come here to the yard office where the depot is now, and to mark up. And they said, you have to have a doctor's release from Dr. Strange, the company doctor. I said, okay, make me an appointment. Well, we can't. I said, what are you talking about? He says, he's in Europe. Well, how am I supposed to go back to work? They didn't give a hang about me or my family, you know. I spent over 30 years being dedicated to the company, getting called all hours of the day and night, rain and shine, sick as a dog, and went to work, never refused to go to work. And now, when I need them, they turn their back on me. So I had a suit against them because Bill would call all hours of the day and night. He'd be drunk, and he'd use profanity that the sailor doesn't use, and accuse me of being a malinger and all that kind of stuff. And to get him off my back, I had to get an attorney. So I got Ed Feaster out of L.A. And I thought, you know, this is ridiculous. So I told Ed what was going on. I said, they won't let me mark up. I can't go to work. I can't retire. I mean, I'm in limbo, and I can't take care of my family. So I said, the Railroad Retirement Board guy is going to be here in town. It was July. I think it was the 23rd, which is very significant to me, because that's the day I met my wife. So I said, would it hurt my case if I went to see him? And he said no. So I go to see him, and I take a stack of medical records a foot high. I've had MRIs and CAT scans and everything else, and I got 2 herniated discs. That's all there is to it. I don't know where Bill got his medical degree, but he said I'm a malinger. So anyhow, the railroad retirement guy said, yeah, he said, you know, if they won't let you go back to work, you may as well retire. Mm-hmm. Well, that was the last I heard. And on the 2nd of January, I got notified, I got a check in the mail, and notified that I was retired as of October 1st.
Oh my goodness.
So I was retired for 3 months and didn't know it.
Didn't even know it.
So that was the end of my career. And if I had it to do over again, I'd be working now, I think. I mean, I really didn't want to retire, but they forced me to. The job, well, it's every kid I know likes electric train, and the only difference is our trains were bigger. We just played train, and it was a very you never did the same thing twice. Mm-hmm. Always something different, always an adventure, a lot of fun, practical jokes. Oh man, a bunch of characters, and the only thing, it's extremely difficult for a family because you're gone so much of the time, you know. Every time there was a crisis, I was gone. I know the kids, my 2 boys, Marty's and my sons, both of them fell. One of them fell against the headboard, I think, and big gash in his head. And I had just been called to go to work. I couldn't call up then, so we ended up calling a neighbor across the street, and the neighbor took Marty and the boy to the hospital, and here I am, I got to go to work. And the other boy, I can't remember, but I wasn't there for him either. And you miss school functions and birthdays and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. It's something you sacrifice. I remember Marty, she'd tell me, honey, can you lay off? I said, let me call Bill. He was a next door neighbor. And what are you going to call him for? Well, to see if he'll make the house payment. Because when you lay off on a railroad, you don't lay off for just one day. You lay off, you can't mark up for 24 hours, but you may have been the 2nd or 3rd out, and when you mark back up, you're 8 or 10 times out. So you might be off for a week, you know. Yeah. So you have to be real discreet about laying off. And then sometimes they'll tell you, no, you can't lay off.
Yeah.
And I can remember when I think it was the last boy we had, I went to Bill, went upstairs, and I said, hey, Bill, is there any chance of getting off? My wife's going to have our baby. He said, just because you were there for the laying of the keel don't mean you have to be there for launching of the boat.
Oh,
That's what he told me. and I said, you know. So he looked at me and he says, yeah, okay. He says, I'll give you a 30-day leave. I said, well, I might not have to take it all, you know.
This has been wonderful talking with you
I talk like
today.
a magpie, you know, I keep talking.
This is great.
I
Thank
could go
you
on for
so
hours
much.
and hours.
Well,
You're
thank
very welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So I just want to say again, this is Clyde Elliot, and we've been talking with him. And he's been sharing stories with us about his career with Southern Pacific Railroad. Thanks for being with us today, Clyde.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Please come back again. We'd love to have you another time.
I shall.
Thank you.